Good morning. It is about 5 o'clock in the morning and I am working on my shadow work journal. I've often heard that if you are woke up between the hours of 3 and like 4 or 5 in the morning, it's because God has something he wants to say to you. So here I am. I'm doing my shadow work. Again, it's the shadow work journal, and again, shadow work is not scary. It is something that is based in psychoanalytic theory, and it is basically a way of digging into your past traumas and dramas and finding out if you have any issues and things that are still affecting you today that you can work through, healing, your inner child, things like that. I'm going to skip back to page 34 and 35 in our book, and this is where they talk about wound mapping. Now, I'm going to go over a couple of things in this video because I think it's important to know, because when I learned about this, I was shocked, and I feel like everyone needs to know. Now, again, I am not a professional. I have an undergraduate degree in psychology, and I am working toward a master's in clinical mental health. So I've learned a lot, and I want to share what I've learned, and you can go from there. If for some reason you feel like you need more help, please go get counseling, find a therapist, find a psychiatrist. There is no shame in doing that. But if this speaks and resonates to you, you might need a little bit of extra help. So in wound mapping, the 4 types of inner child wounds are abandonment, guilt, trust, and neglect. And it's possible that more than one of these might resonate with you. Again, this is on page 34. And the reason why is because being hurt or traumatized, particularly during childhood, can be deeply painful. And these wounds often lead to negative behaviors and thought patterns that do not serve you well. So before I get to this page right here, with the wounds and the different behaviors associated with those, I have to talk about something called the ACEs study. And a lot of people are not aware of the ACEs study, but it is so incredibly important. And when I first read about it, I was shook. I was so shook. I was in a child development class, and I was in a trauma-informed educator class. And basically, the ACEs study was done by Vincent Folletti and Robert Anda at Kaiser Permanente in California. And they launched the study of how adverse childhood experiences affect health and how it's everyone's issue. And it's absolutely fascinating, because especially if you're someone that's watching this video and you have had a lot of things happen to you, I could bet the farm that you have had health issues, that you have had emotional issues, that you have had any number of things that years later, years after the abuse, years after the neglect, years after the trauma. In this particular study, which this study included middle-class white families, because it was in a specific part of California, and that just happened to be the demographic. But I don't necessarily think that this is limited strictly to just those parameters. But what they found was 45% of students had at least one ACE, and 22% of students had multiple ACEs. So what they decided that an ACE was, let me get my other book so I can make sure that I'm telling you correctly. So they include physical and sexual abuse, physical and emotional neglect, family dysfunction, such as having parents who were divorced, mentally ill, addicted, or in prison. So that was just a handful of, like what they considered adverse childhood experiences. And that isn't an exhaustive list. And again, we always say that, trauma is very specific to the person. So it may not have affected someone else the same way it affected you, but if it affected you in a way that you have a lot of trauma held to it, then it's an adverse childhood experience, and it should be treated as such. So in this, they talk about, the book that I'm talking out of right now is called The Body Keeps Score. And so in the shadow work journal, you're doing inner child work. And the reason that I'm bringing up these things, the reason that I'm bringing up adverse childhood experiences studies is because children have been harmed. You have been harmed. There are things that have happened to you. The percentages of people, like I said, 45% had at least one ACE, which means maybe their parents were divorced. 22% of students had multiple ACEs, and 1 in 16 students had an ACE score of higher than 4. And why this is important is because there is a dose effect to ACE scores. And a dose effect suggests that the number of traumatic occurrences even more increases the severity of the effect on the person. So a person who has 1 ACE score, sorry, my husband's alarm's going off. If a person has 1 ACE score, they're going to have effects, but a person with 4 ACE scores is going to have probably even more effects from that. So the ACE study showed a remarkable link between not okay childhood events, and that's what they considered, adverse childhood experiences, things that are just not okay, that should not happen to children. And it said at this point in time, in a report of child abuse was made every 10 seconds, and in 2010 it was the second leading cause of death among children ages 12 to 17. And that is sad. One of the other things that they noted was the effect on attendance and behavior and coursework and health. It's exponential that you have problems the higher those ACE scores go. And so this is the body keeps score. And basically the body keeps score basically tells us that if you have had trauma, if you have had things happen to you and you are finding yourself years later suffering, that it is not your fault, that your body has held on to the grief, your body has held on to the stress, your body has held on to the trauma. And in this particular book, it says that actually the ACE study started because they were doing like obesity studies, and they started to find a pattern between like people telling stories of adverse childhood experiences and obesity. So they found a link between obesity and these adverse childhood scores. And of course, self-harm rose exponentially with ACE scores. Depression in adulthood rose dramatically with an ACE score of 4 or more. The likelihood of being on an antidepressant medication also rose. People with ACE scores of 4 were seven times more likely to be alcoholics than those with 0. Injection drug use increased exponentially, and for those with an ACE score of 6 or more, the likelihood of IV drug use was 4,600% greater than if you did not have ACE scores. And then there's also the high risk behaviors that come sometimes with high ACE scores. Smoking, unintended pregnancies, multiple sexual partners, sexually transmitted disease. If you have 6 or more of these ACE scores, and again, that list that I gave you of like divorce, things like that is not an exhaustive list. That is just a general list. Anything that was an adverse childhood experience, a not okay experience in your childhood, it might have been moving, it might have been death of a family member, it might have been a family member being incarcerated, it might have been a family member suffering from mental illness or alcoholism. There's a lot of different things. But if you had that, you were leading in dying. What does it say? 15% or greater chance with those of an ACE score of 0 suffering from the 10 leading causes of death, including chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, ischemic heart disease, and liver disease. And they were twice as likely to suffer from cancer and 4 times as likely to have emphysema, which is just proof that the ongoing stress on the body is keeping a toll on the body. So that the reason why I shared all of that, and I know that probably felt like, gibberish, but the reason that I shared that with you is because there's a reason that doing inner childhood healing work is important. And it's not just, to calm your brain. It's not just that. It's because your body is carrying this weight, and this weight is hard. And through studies, through science, it has been shown that that weight will eventually eat you alive. And I know I have, my ACE score is like 4 or something like that. I mean, it's up there. And I can testify to the fact that grief feels like sometimes it is just eating my body alive. And so that is why it's important to do this shadow work, to do this inner child healing. So let's go over this page, and I will put a picture of this page right here at the end of the video so that you can see. But the first wound that they want to talk about is the abandonment wound. And here are some of the things that you might look for if you feel like you are suffering from the abandonment wound. If you feel left out constantly, if you fear being left out, if you hate being alone, if you have to have somebody with you, if you have codependency issues where you and another person tend to go back and forth sharing and enabling and a toxic relationship, threatens to leave, normally attracts emotionally unavailable people. That means that you tend to pick people that only perpetuate your feeling of abandonment. Your guilt wound, feels sorry or bad, doesn't like to ask for things, uses guilt to manipulate, is afraid to set boundaries, and normally attracts people who make them feel guilty. And it's so incredibly weird to me that, you know, those wounds that we have tend to attract people that feed into those wounds, which is another reason why we need to work on healing, because we want to attract healed people. Trust wound. Is it afraid to be hurt? It's afraid to be hurt, doesn't trust themselves, finds ways to not trust people, which means you might be dating a guy who is just literally good on paper, absolutely wonderful, and you're like, you know what? He folds his towels, hot dog, not hamburger, and I just can't stand it. You know, so you're just finding nitpicky little reasons why this person isn't good enough. Feel insecure and needs a lot of external validation. And this is the person like that's constantly, is it okay? What do you think? Do you think it's okay? Does it look all right? Do you think this, did you read that? What did you think about that? Should I turn it in? Do you think I should change this? Do you think, you know, there are those people that are constantly doing that. And they normally attract people who don't feel safe. And sometimes I wonder with that one, if that's because if they don't feel safe, then that person tends to kind of cling to the other person. Again, talking that kind of codependent relationship, you know, cling to the person with the trust wound and stuff like that, because it's like, you know, it helps because it's like, well, if they're too scared and they don't feel safe, they cling to me, then I feel better. I feel like I can trust that I'm safe. And the last one is the neglect wound. Struggles to let things go, has low self-esteem, gets angrily easily, struggles to say no, represses emotions, fears being vulnerable. Brene Brown has a lot of really great work on vulnerability. Look it up. She has a good TED Talk on it too. Normally attracts people who don't appreciate them or make them feel seen. So isn't that interesting? If you have struggled with neglect, you tend to attract people who make you feel like you're not seen, which means you're just being neglected all over again. And again, that's because those adverse childhood experiences, those things that we have not worked through, the body is holding on to it. The body is keeping score. It doesn't mean that this is a life sentence. It just means we've got some work to do, don't we? So the books that I was going through today is the Shadow Work Journal, which we've been doing. The Body Keeps Score by Bessel van der Kolk. What a name, huh? Very cool name, though. And then this is, actually, I went through this book when I was going through a trauma-informed educator course, and it literally shook my snow globe as far as, like, my understanding of myself and of children and of students. But it's by Kristen Sowers and Pete Hall, and it's called Fostering Resilient Learners. They also have another one, Relationship, Responsibility, and Regulation, Trauma-Invested Practices. So, those books are something good, because when you're doing your shadow work, this is a great tool, but there's a lot of good stuff out there to help you. And I hope that I'm helping to shed some light on why all of these things are important and why they make sense and why doing this work is important to you. So I will put this at the end of the video so that way you can see it, the wound mapping. But remember, take care of yourself, your precious cargo. And why? Because Mama said so.